Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's get back to today's story. But as the minutes passed, Mark realized that he didn't have much of a choice. The offer was too good to ignore. Mark didn't waste any time as he made his way back to the small, run-down apartment he called home. The rain had finally stopped, but the feeling of being drenched didn't leave him. His mind was racing, replaying Eleanor's words over and over again. Marry her? The offer was still so surreal. But as he reached his door and unlocked it, he realized there was no turning back. He was staring at the mountain of bills on the small kitchen table, the weight of debt pressing harder with each passing day. Maybe this was his only chance to escape. The next day, Eleanor's lawyer sent over the paperwork. A marriage contract. Terms and conditions that felt cold, clinical, as if they were sealing a business deal rather than a personal commitment. Mark stared at the document spread out before him on the table. Marriage contract, the word seemed almost absurd. He could already hear Eleanor's calm voice in his head, telling him that it wasn't about love. But how could he reconcile that with the idea of actually going through with it? Mark had little time to think. By the evening, he was back at the Brooks estate, standing at the gates of her mansion, feeling a strange sense of foreboding. Eleanor's offer had been clear would be the perfect husband for her, someone who could provide the stability she needed for her legacy. But in return, she would pay off all his debts, make sure his family was secure. He couldn't deny the temptation. The mansion loomed in front of him, the large stone pillars standing tall like silent sentinels, guarding the wealth and power inside. The lavish estate seemed out of place for someone like Mark, a poor student with nothing but his dreams of a better future. He took a deep breath and rang the doorbell. The door swung open, and there she stood, Eleanor, Berkshire, silver hair gleaming under the chandelier light, her expression as controlled and composed as ever. Mark, welcome, she said, her voice smooth, almost soothing. She stepped aside to let him in. Inside, the mansion was as impressive as he had imagined. Expensive paintings lined the walls, the furniture gleamed with wealth, and the scent of fresh flowers lingered in the air. It was a world he had never known, a world that seemed so far removed from his struggles. Yet, he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. Dinner will be served soon, Eleanor said, her tone businesslike. I thought we could discuss the terms of our arrangement. Mark nodded, trying to hide the knot in his stomach. This was not what he had imagined his life would be like. Not in a million years would he have thought he'd be standing in a millionaire's mansion, about to marry a woman he barely knew for the sake of money and security. But the reality of his situation hit him every time he glanced at the piles of overdue bills back home. As they walked to the dining room, Eleanor led him to the table, where an extravagant meal awaited them. The silverware sparkled under the soft glow of the candlelight, and the aroma of perfectly cooked dishes filled the air. For a moment, Mark felt a pang of guilt. He wasn't sure if he was doing the right thing. But he had no other choice. He sat down, his mind still racing. As Eleanor took her seat across from him, she didn't waste any time. The contract is simple, she said. You will marry me. We will live together as husband and wife, but the nature of our relationship will be professional. No public displays of affection. No intimacy. We will present ourselves as a married couple for appearance's sake, and that will be all. Mark listened intently, feeling the weight of the decision settling in. This was no fairy tale. This was a business deal. The thought made his stomach churn, but the promise of freedom from his financial troubles was too great to ignore. There will be public events, Eleanor continued, gatherings, parties, business meetings. You will attend these with me as my husband, and in return, I will ensure that your debts are cleared. You will also have full access to my resources, including a place to live, financial support, and security. Mark looked at her, his mind trying to process the cold, detached offer. It wasn't what he had hoped for, but it was an opportunity. His family needed the money. His mother's medical bills were piling up, and his younger sister's tuition fees were due. Every part of him wanted to refuse, but the thought of his his mother's tired face and the worry in his sister's eyes kept him from walking away. He took a deep breath, his decision weighing heavily on him. "I agree," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But I have one condition. I need time to think. To understand exactly what I'm getting myself into." Eleanor raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Of course. Take the time you need, but remember, this offer is not indefinite." Mark stood up, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. He had made his choice, but it was hard to shake the feeling that he was stepping into something far bigger than he could handle. As he left the mansion, Eleanor's words echoed in his head. He had agreed to marry her, to live a life that was not his own. But was this the path to freedom or the beginning of a new kind of trap? Only time would tell. Mark climbed into his car, his mind still reeling. He knew he had made the right choice for his family. But deep down, something told him that this arrangement would change everything. The following day, Mark found himself standing in the grand foyer of Eleanor's mansion once again. The feeling of being out of place had intensified. Everything about this house, from the polished floors to the chandeliers overhead, screamed wealth that was so far beyond his grasp. He stood there, nervously clutching the papers she had sent him the night before. He had barely slept, his mind constantly swirling with doubts. But the truth was, he had no other options. The reality of his debts, his family's struggles, was too much to ignore. He had made his decision, but he was still unsure if he could really go through with it. Eleanor's lawyer had arranged everything. The marriage contract was simple, almost too simple. It was more like a business agreement than a personal connection. No love. No intimacy. Just two people bound by a shared need: her legacy and his survival. The more Mark read the terms, the more detached it felt, but when he thought about his family, his mother's mounting hospital bills, his younger sister's future slipping away, he knew there was no turning back. He had agreed to marry her, to live a life he never thought he'd lead, but it still didn't feel real. Eleanor had given him a week to think it over, and now, standing in her lavish home, it felt like his decision was finally becoming a reality. "You're here," Eleanor's voice broke his thoughts. He looked up to see her standing at the top of the staircase, a serene smile on her face. "I see you've had time to think it over. Have you made your decision?" Mark nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "Yes," he said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. "I'm ready." Her smile widened slightly, and she descended the stairs, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "Good," she said, her voice calm but firm. "We'll go over the details again, just to be sure we're on the same page." They walked together into the study, a large room filled with leather-bound books and expensive furniture. Eleanor gestured for him to sit across from her at the large wooden desk. She handed him a copy of the contract, and they went over the terms one last time. "You will live here with me as my husband," she began, her tone businesslike. "But our relationship will remain strictly professional. There will be no expectations of affection or emotional attachment." She paused, looking directly at him. "Our lives will be separate in every way except for public appearances. You will attend events with me, and you will be a part of my world. That is the nature of our arrangement." Mark nodded again, his mind racing. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it all feel more real. He wasn't marrying for love. He was marrying for survival. His heart sank a little, but the thought of his family's future kept him moving forward. "Is this really what you want?" Eleanor asked, her gaze softening for the first time. "I know this is a big decision. And I understand it's not easy. But you need to know that this will change your life. It will change everything." Mark met her gaze, his eyes steady. "I don't have a choice," he said quietly. "My family needs this. I need this. I can't keep struggling like this. I'm in. There was a long pause, and for a moment, Eleanor didn't say anything. Then she spoke again, her voice softer this time. I appreciate your honesty, Mark. But this arrangement is about more than just your debts. It's about securing both of our futures. This will be your new life now, and I'll expect you to carry your part of the deal. Mark's chest tightened. He had heard the words before, but now they felt heavier. This was more than a financial transaction. He was entering into a contract that would change the course of his life. He wasn't just marrying a woman he barely knew, he was marrying into a world that was foreign to him, a world of wealth, power, and public scrutiny. Eleanor stood up and walked to the window, her back to him. I don't expect this to be easy. But I promise you this, your life will be better. Your family will be taken care of. I'll make sure of it. Mark took a deep breath. He had made his decision. He would marry her not because he loved her, but because he needed the chance to change his life. He needed the opportunity to fix everything he had lost. I'm ready, he said, standing up from his chair. Let's do this. Eleanor turned, her smile returning, but this time it wasn't as cold. It was knowing, almost understanding. She held out her hand. Then welcome to your new life, Mark. As he shook her hand, a strange mix of fear and anticipation gripped him. He was stepping into the unknown. His life as he knew it was about to change forever. The decision had been made. Now, it was time to live with the consequences. The following week, Mark found himself settling into a new routine, one that was both strange and unsettling. He had moved into Eleanor's mansion, a place so grand it felt more like a palace than a home. The soft hum of daily life seemed far removed from the constant stress and strain he had known. The house was large, cold, and beautifully decorated, but it didn't feel like home, not yet, anyway. He spent his days adjusting to a life that had no real connection to his past. He wasn't just living with Eleanor, he was living in her world, a world of wealth and power that he didn't fully understand. Every day was filled with something new: formal dinners, business meetings, charity events. Eleanor had made it clear that this was part of their arrangement. They were to be seen as a married couple, but the reality was far from romantic. There was no affection between them, no smiles or shared moments of intimacy. Their interactions were businesslike, efficient, and distant. But as the days passed, Mark found himself watching Eleanor more closely. She was different from what he had expected. Her beauty was striking, but it was her sharp mind and calm demeanor that left an impression on him. She was a woman who was in control, always one step ahead, always composed. Despite their arrangement, Mark couldn't help but admire her strength. One evening, as they were leaving a charity gala, Eleanor turned to him as they made their way through the grand lobby. You're doing well so far, she said, her voice soft but firm. You've learned how to blend in with my world. That's not easy. Mark nodded, unsure of how to respond. He wasn't sure if she meant it as a compliment or if it was just another observation. Eleanor's words were always measured, never too personal, but always meaningful. The gala had been a whirlwind. Mark had been introduced to countless people, business partners, politicians, high society elites, all with sharp eyes and perfect manners. He had never felt more out of place. But Eleanor had been by his side the entire time, guiding him through the evening with ease, showing him how to act, what to say. In the sea of unfamiliar faces, she was the only one he could trust. That night, as they drove back to the mansion in the back of a sleek black car, Mark couldn't shake the feeling of unease. He had agreed to this arrangement, but was it truly the right thing? He had no love for Eleanor, yet he found himself thinking about her more often than he'd like to admit. She was a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out, a woman who had her life perfectly mapped out. But there was something about her, something that made him want to know more. As the car pulled up to the mansion, Mark's thoughts were interrupted. Eleanor spoke again, her tone still calm. I know this isn't easy for you, Mark. But remember, this is for your family. This is the life we agreed on. He nodded silently, trying to push away the gnawing feeling in his stomach. He had promised himself he wouldn't get too emotionally involved. This was a business deal, nothing more. Inside the house, Eleanor led him to a small study that overlooked the expansive grounds. "You'll be more comfortable here," she said, offering him a drink. "We need to start planning our next steps. There are upcoming meetings that will require your presence, and we need to continue the charade." Mark nodded, feeling a sense of responsibility creeping in. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about maintaining the illusion, about playing the part that had been assigned to him. As he sat down in the study, his thoughts wandered. He had agreed to this arrangement, but now that he was living it, it felt more like a trap than a solution. He wasn't sure where this was all leading, but he knew one thing: he couldn't back out now. The stakes were too high. His family depended on him. And he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The hours passed quietly, Eleanor working at her desk while Mark sat in a chair, silently observing her. There was a calmness about her, a sense of control that Mark both admired and feared. He knew that beneath her composed exterior was someone who had fought hard to get where she was, someone who wouldn't let anything stand in her way. As the night wore on, Eleanor looked up from her papers, meeting Mark's gaze. "I know you're having doubts," she said quietly. "It's normal. But trust me, this is the right path for both of us. I won't let you fail." Mark nodded, grateful for her reassurance, though part of him still wasn't convinced. "I'm doing this for my family," he said softly. "That's what keeps me going." Eleanor smiled faintly, her eyes softening for the first time. "Good," she said. "Then we're in this together. You won't regret it." As Mark left the study later that night, he couldn't help but wonder, was this truly the right path, or was he just too far in to back out? Only time would tell. As the weeks passed, Mark found himself adjusting to the new life he had chosen, though it was still difficult to shake the feeling that something was missing. Eleanor had kept her word. His debts were cleared, his family was secure, and he had a place to stay, but the emotional cost of the arrangement was becoming clearer every day. He had learned to live with the disconnect between them, the lack of intimacy, but something still gnawed at him. He hadn't expected love, had never thought that he would fall for her, but there were moments when he caught himself wondering if there was more to this arrangement than he had realized. The events they attended together were becoming routine: charity galas, business meetings, networking dinners. Eleanor's life was a whirlwind, and he was now an official part of it. But as he mingled with her colleagues and clients, he couldn't help but feel like an outsider. Eleanor moved through the world effortlessly, while he struggled to blend in. It wasn't just the wealth and the social connections, it was the ease with which she navigated every situation. She was the center of attention wherever they went, and Mark remained in the background, a prop in the well-rehearsed play they had created. One evening, after a particularly exhausting dinner event, Mark found himself walking through the mansion's vast corridors, his mind wandering. Eleanor had retreated to her office after the event, as she often did, leaving him alone with his thoughts. The mansion was quiet, almost eerily so, and Mark felt a strange sense of isolation. He wasn't sure what he had expected when he agreed to this, maybe something that felt more real, more like a partnership, but what he had was a carefully crafted illusion. He was part of her world, yes, but he wasn't really a part of her life. As he passed by one of the guest rooms, he heard faint laughter. He paused, curious, before stepping closer to the door. He could hear Eleanor's voice on the other side, but there was something different about her tone, softer, warmer. Mark's curiosity got the better of him, and he quietly opened the door just a crack. What he saw startled him. Eleanor was sitting on the floor, laughing with a child. Mark's first thought was that it was a niece or a nephew, but as he looked closer, he realized the child wasn't related to her. The little girl, no older than 6, was sitting on Eleanor's lap, her small hand resting on Eleanor's chest as they both giggled over something the child had said. The moment felt incredibly intimate, so different from the cool, businesslike persona Eleanor usually portrayed. Mark stepped back quickly, but not before Eleanor saw him. She looked up and caught his eye, her expression unreadable for a moment. Then, she gave him a small, almost apologetic smile. Sorry, I didn't mean to surprise you, she said softly, motioning for him to come inside. This is Emily. She's a friend's daughter. I just wanted to spend a little time with her. Mark hesitated before stepping into the room. He had never seen this side of Eleanor before. The woman who was so controlled, so business-focused, was now showing a side of herself that was unexpectedly warm and tender. He couldn't help but wonder what this meant. Was this the real Eleanor, or just another carefully constructed mask? The little girl, Emily, looked up at him curiously. Hi, are you her husband? She asked, her voice sweet and innocent. Eleanor chuckled softly. Yes, he is. But don't let him fool you. He's still getting used to the idea. Mark forced a smile, feeling a bit out of place. I guess I am, he replied, his voice lacking the confidence it usually had. He wasn't used to being called a husband, not in this situation, not when everything about their relationship felt so distant. After a few moments of awkward silence, Eleanor stood up, gently lifting Emily into her arms. Well, I should get her back to her parents, she said. I didn't mean to disturb you, Mark. Mark nodded, still unsure of what to say. As Eleanor carried Emily out of the room, he couldn't help but feel a pang of longing. There was something about the way she interacted with the little girl that made him realize just how far apart they were. He had agreed to this arrangement for the sake of his family, but was it possible that he had also started to crave something more, something real? That night, as he lay in bed, Mark couldn't shake the image of Eleanor with Emily. It wasn't just the tenderness he had witnessed, it was the contrast between that moment and everything else he had experienced in his marriage. Was this what he was missing? Was he just a placeholder in her life, or was there something deeper that they had yet to explore? He didn't know the answers yet, but one thing was clear: he had never felt more uncertain about his future. The next morning, Eleanor seemed as composed as ever. She didn't mention the night before, and neither did Mark. But as they sat down for breakfast, Mark couldn't help but wonder how long could they keep pretending that this was just a business arrangement? How long could he keep telling himself that he wasn't falling for her? And most importantly, how long could Eleanor keep hiding the truth of who she really was from him? Days passed, and Mark's unease continued to grow. The reality of their arrangement had settled in, and he couldn't deny that the lines between their business contract and something deeper were beginning to blur. Eleanor remained as composed as ever, her life still revolving around the business and social events that demanded her attention. But Mark had noticed something. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, where she seemed less like the cold, calculating woman he had first met and more like someone who was capable of feeling something real. He couldn't help but wonder if he was starting to see the woman beneath the mask. The tension between them had also started to shift. During their quiet dinners at the mansion or in the car on the way to an event, Eleanor seemed more relaxed, as if she were slowly letting her guard down. She would share little anecdotes about her childhood or stories about her business ventures. Mark had grown more comfortable in her world, but the emotional distance was still there, always lurking just beneath the surface. The contract they had signed was still the foundation of their relationship, but Mark couldn't help but question how long they could keep pretending it was just business. One evening, Eleanor invited him to a dinner party with a few of her closest associates. The event was elegant, filled with rich conversations, laughter, and the clinking of glasses. Mark found himself sitting at a table, surrounded by people who talked about the latest investments, the stock market, and the political landscape, topics he didn't fully understand but tried to keep up with. Eleanor, as always, was the center of attention, and Mark played the role of the perfect husband. He smiled, nodded, and joined in the discussions when needed, but it all felt so empty. He wasn't part of this world, not really. He was still just playing a role. After the dinner, they were both in the car on their way back to the mansion. The drive was long, and the silence between them felt heavier than usual. Mark stole a glance at Eleanor. She was staring out the window, lost in thought, her expression unreadable. He couldn't help but ask, "Do you ever get tired of all this?" She turned to him, surprised by the question, and then smiled softly. "All of what?" she asked, her tone gentle, but still distant. Mark shifted in his seat, feeling the weight of the moment. The parties, the business, the constant pressure. Doesn't it ever feel like too much? Eleanor was silent for a long moment, her gaze returning to the dark road ahead. Finally, she spoke. It's the life I chose, Mark. I've worked hard to get here. There's no room for weakness. Mark nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more she wasn't saying. Is that why you never let anyone get close? He asked quietly. This time, Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she let out a long sigh, her shoulders slumping ever so slightly. People get too close, and they start to want things, she said, her voice almost inaudible. I can't afford that. Not anymore. Mark didn't know how to respond. He wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but he knew better. He couldn't cross that line. They were still bound by the contract. Still, he couldn't ignore the flicker of vulnerability he saw in her eyes, the brief crack in her otherwise impenetrable armor. The rest of the drive passed in silence. When they arrived at the mansion, Eleanor didn't say anything more. She simply got out of the car and walked toward the front door, her posture once again straight and rigid. Mark watched her go, his thoughts spinning. He had always thought of Eleanor as untouchable, a woman who had built her empire with cold precision. But now, he wasn't so sure. There was something more to her, something he had started to see, something that made him feel like he was slowly unraveling the mystery of who she really was. Later that night, as Mark sat alone in his room, the weight of his decision settled over him again. He had agreed to this arrangement, to marry a woman he barely knew for the sake of his family, but now it felt like something deeper was at play. Was it possible he had begun to care for her? Or was he simply imagining things? The lines between their business arrangement and something real were blurring more each day. He couldn't deny that the attraction was there, but what did that mean? Eleanor had made it clear that this wasn't about love. It was about security. But as the days passed, Mark found himself wanting more than just security, more than just a contract. He wanted something real, something that felt like it mattered. And as for Eleanor, was she starting to feel the same way, or was he just a pawn in her carefully crafted game? He didn't know the answers yet, but one thing was certain: things were about to get even more complicated. The next few days passed by in a blur of charity events, business meetings, and silent dinners, but Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was changing between him and Eleanor. He had expected this arrangement to remain cold, transactional, a business deal, nothing more, but the cracks in their carefully constructed facade were starting to show. Eleanor had begun to act differently around him, though she would never admit it. She was still as professional as ever, still holding herself to the high standards she had set, but there were moments when her guard seemed to drop. When she caught his gaze across the room, there was something in her eyes, a flicker of warmth, an acknowledgement that wasn't there before. It was during one of these quiet moments that Mark found himself questioning everything. They had just returned from another high society event, and as usual, Eleanor had gone straight to her office to work. Mark, though, was tired of the game. He had lived his whole life trying to keep up with the world around him, but for once, he wanted to stop pretending. He didn't want to be a prop in her life anymore. He didn't want to just play the part of the dutiful husband, wanted more. That evening, as Eleanor walked through the mansion, her footsteps light but purposeful, Mark approached her in the hallway. She stopped when she saw him, a surprised look crossing her face. "Mark," she said, her voice soft but guarded. "We need to talk," Mark said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions inside him. He had never felt so sure about anything in his life. Eleanor raised an eyebrow, clearly not expecting this. "About what?" she asked, her tone still calm, but there was a slight tension in her posture now. Mark took a deep breath. This wasn't easy for him, but he had to say it. "About us. About this arrangement. It's not working for me anymore." There was a pause. Eleanor didn't say anything right away. She just stared at him, her expression unreadable. Mark could feel the weight of her gaze, could see the slight tightening of her jaw as she processed his words. "You knew what this was when you agreed to it, Mark," she said finally, her voice low but firm. "This isn't about emotions or feelings, it's about what we need, what we've both agreed to." Mark shook his head, frustration bubbling to the surface. I know what we agreed to, Eleanor, but I can't keep pretending. I can't keep playing this role, acting like we're not both feeling something more. I don't know what it is, but there's something between us, and I'm not going to ignore it anymore. Eleanor's eyes softened for a brief moment, but then she quickly masked it with her usual composed expression. She crossed her arms, a protective barrier. You're overthinking this. There's nothing between us, Mark. This is just business. Nothing more. Mark's heart sank at her words, but he refused to back down. I don't believe you, he said quietly. I think you're lying to yourself. You can pretend all you want, but I know you better than that. I've seen how you look at me sometimes. You can't keep acting like you don't care. I'm not going to be just another business deal for you. The silence that followed felt heavy. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Mark could feel the distance growing between them, but he knew there was no turning back now. He had to say what was on his mind, even if it meant risking everything. Finally, Eleanor spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. You're right. I've been pretending. But this isn't something I can change. Not now. Not after everything I've worked for. Mark took a step closer, his heart racing. Eleanor, this isn't just about work or power. This is about us. We're both stuck in this, pretending it's not what it is. But I can't keep doing this anymore. Not without knowing where I stand. There was a long pause before Eleanor finally looked away, her eyes falling to the floor. When she spoke again, her voice was soft, almost defeated. I don't know what you want from me, Mark. I don't know how to give you what you need. Mark reached out, gently touching her arm. I just want honesty. I just want something real. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes searching his face. There was a vulnerability there, a crack in her armor that Mark had never seen before. For the first time, she seemed uncertain, like she didn't have all the answers, like she didn't know how to fix this. And for the first time, Mark realized that they were both just as lost as each other. As they stood there, in the quiet hallway of the mansion, neither of them said another word. The tension hung between them, heavy and unresolved, but for the first time in a long time, they were no longer just playing a role. They were both searching for something more. The next morning, Mark woke up early, his mind still buzzing from the conversation he and Eleanor had the night before. It had felt like a turning point. For the first time since their marriage, he felt like they had crossed some invisible line. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, and Mark wasn't sure what came next. He had told her the truth about what he was feeling, but Eleanor, as always, had her walls up. She had never been one to show weakness, to reveal the cracks in her carefully constructed life. And yet, in the moments before their conversation ended, he had seen something in her eyes, a flicker of vulnerability. Something real, something raw, that he knew she wasn't ready to confront. As the day went on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that things were shifting between them. He had been avoiding Eleanor's office, not wanting to face the discomfort that lingered after their conversation. But by mid-afternoon, he could feel the weight of it all pressing in. He couldn't keep pretending that nothing had changed. He needed to speak to her again, to make sure they both understood what this meant. What they meant. When he found her in the study, she was working, as usual. The same cold, focused Eleanor he had first met. But this time, there was a noticeable tension in the air, as if neither of them knew how to bridge the gap that had formed between them. Mark took a deep breath and walked in, closing the door softly behind him. Eleanor looked up briefly, then went back to her paperwork, but Mark wasn't going to let it slide. Eleanor, he said, his voice steady but firm. She didn't look up. What is it, Mark? She asked, her tone professional, like they were back to where they had started. Nothing personal, nothing beyond the contract. Mark walked closer, his heart pounding. We need to talk about what happened last night, he said quietly. At his words, Eleanor's shoulders stiffened. She set her pen down and finally looked up at him, her eyes narrowing slightly, as if trying to gauge whether he was serious. "What about it?" she asked. "What do we do now?" Mark asked, his voice quieter, almost hesitant. "You said it yourself, Eleanor. We're both pretending. But I can't keep doing that. Not anymore." The silence between them grew thick, heavier with each passing second. Eleanor's face softened slightly, but she still didn't speak. She took a deep breath, trying to maintain her composure. "You knew what this was from the beginning, Mark," she said finally, her voice quieter than usual, but still firm. "I'm not sure what you want from me, but this is my life. This is the life I've built. And I can't change it now." Mark nodded, trying to keep his emotions in check. "I'm not asking you to change everything," he said. "But I can't keep living like this. I can't just pretend we're not both feeling something. You can say this is just business, but it's more than that now, and you know it." Eleanor looked down at her hands, her expression guarded. She was quiet for a long time, her mind clearly racing. Finally, she looked back at him, her eyes searching his face. "What do you want me to say, Mark?" she asked softly. Mark stepped closer, his heart in his throat. "I want you to be honest with me. I want to know if you feel what I feel. Or if this was just a game to you. Because if that's the case, then I need to know. I can't keep pretending like I don't care." For the first time, Eleanor's guard seemed to lower. Her eyes softened, and for a brief moment, she looked almost vulnerable. She took a deep breath before answering, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know what I feel, Mark," she admitted. "I never allowed myself to feel anything. This arrangement, it was supposed to be simple, clean. But somewhere along the way, things got complicated." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He could hear the sincerity in her voice, the crack in her composure. He didn't know what it meant, but it felt like a breakthrough. "We can figure this out, Eleanor," he said gently. "But we can't keep pretending like it's nothing." She nodded slowly, the weight of the moment settling between them. Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes locking with his, and for the first time in a long time, they were truly present with each other. "I know," she whispered. "I'll try." Mark felt a surge of relief, but at the same time, doubt lingered in the back of his mind. This was far from over. They were at a crossroads, and there was no telling where this path would lead. But for the first time, he felt like they were finally being honest with each other. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something real. As they stood there, in the quiet of her study, neither of them said anything else. But Mark knew that this moment, this raw, unfiltered exchange had changed everything. What they had now was no longer just a contract. It was the beginning of something far more complicated, far more real. The following days were filled with a new kind of tension, one that neither Mark nor Eleanor had expected. They had reached an unspoken understanding, a moment of honesty that had opened up a path neither of them could walk away from. But that didn't make everything easier. The reality of their situation was still heavy. Their lives were entwined, but their emotions were fragile, like a delicate thread ready to snap if pulled too hard. Mark found himself thinking about Eleanor more than he had in weeks. She was no longer just the woman who had given him a lifeline, she was someone he couldn't ignore, someone who had become impossible to dismiss. The walls she had built around herself had started to crack, and for the first time, he wondered if she saw him as more than just a business partner. The moments they shared, those fleeting glances, the way she seemed to seek his presence felt different now. He was no longer just playing the role of her husband, he was becoming a part of her life, and that was both thrilling and terrifying. It was during a quiet evening, after another whirlwind day filled with meetings and charity events, that Mark finally decided to act on the feelings he had been trying to ignore. He couldn't keep waiting for Eleanor to make the first move. If they were ever going to figure this out, he needed to be honest with her, once and for all. He found her in the living room, staring out the large windows that overlooked the manicured gardens. The soft glow of the lights reflected in her eyes, and for a moment, she looked lost in thought. Mark took a deep breath, stepping into the room, the sound of his footsteps breaking the silence. Eleanor turned toward him, her expression softening when she saw him. "Mark," she said, her voice quiet, but there was a warmth in it that hadn't been there before. "Eleanor," Mark replied, his voice steady, but his heart racing. "We need to talk. About everything. About us." She raised an eyebrow, as if surprised by his directness. "I thought we already had this conversation," she said, but there was no coldness in her tone, only curiosity. Mark shook his head, walking closer. "No, we haven't. We talked around it, but we haven't really said it out loud. I can't keep pretending this is just a contract. I can't keep pretending that I don't feel something real for you." Eleanor's gaze softened, her lips parting as if she were about to say something, but no words came out at first. She took a step closer to him, her eyes searching his face, and in that moment, Mark saw the truth reflected in her eyes. She was just as unsure as he was, just as vulnerable, but she was trying to keep it together. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying so hard not to let myself feel anything. But I can't deny it anymore. I care about you, Mark." Mark's heart skipped a beat. Hearing those words from her, after everything they had been through, felt like a revelation. The walls that had stood between them for so long were finally coming down. "I care about you too," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I need to know, can we really make this work? Can we really make something real out of this?" Eleanor looked at him, her eyes full of doubt and hope. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I want to try. I can't keep living like this, pretending I don't want something more." Mark smiled, a weight lifting off his shoulders. For the first time in weeks, he felt like they were both finally on the same page. It wasn't going to be easy, but they were ready to face whatever came next, together. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable, it was filled with the promise of something new. Something that neither of them had expected, but both of them were ready to explore. As the evening drew to a close, Mark and Eleanor stood together by the window, looking out at the garden. The world outside was quiet, but inside, everything was changing. They were no longer just two people playing a role, they were two people, finally ready to face the truth of their feelings. Mark took Eleanor's hand, his grip steady and sure. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly, "one step at a time." Eleanor nodded, her eyes meeting his, a small smile tugging at her lips. "One step at a time," she repeated, and for the first time, Mark believed that they were on the right path. It wasn't the ending he had expected when they first met, but it was the beginning of something real, something they both could build together. The road ahead would be complicated, filled with challenges, but for the first time, Mark was willing to walk it with her.